artist. Number one. What, no song? You can think of it? But we've all encountered racism in our lives. Some of us even within the church. Not one song proves my point. There's not one song since 1964 that any black British gospel artist has recorded that deals explicitly with the relationship between racism and the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not a liberation genre. The best that you get from British gospel is welfare. It will talk about some of the social issues. There might be a bit of gang trouble. There might be a bit of trouble in the world. But it has no liberation focus. No attempt to confront them and say what God has to deal with them. That's the what. Say what? What? Now say why. Why does it happen? It happens for two reasons. It happens firstly because of the hostile social environment in which gospel music was birthed within Britain. What do I mean by the hostile social environment? Three things. Since 1948, black people have had to contend with three powerful hostile forces. But these forces shaped the first 10 years. First of all, we came here by accident. We were not invited. 1948 Immigration Act meant that we could come here because the doors were closed before. 1947, they sent all the West Indians back. 1947, they told displaced white European people to come in. We were never wanted here. So when we arrived here, we did not arrive here as people who were welcomed. We weren't meant to be here. First part of the hostile social environment. Second part of the hostile social environment that our parents' generation faced, that we still face in many ways, we were racialized. What do you mean by we were racialized? My parents came here on a British passport. They were British citizens. They were colonial citizens of the empire. They thought they were Jamaicans, Barbadians, Castilians, Trinidadians. Then all of a sudden, they became black. My dad said to me, the first time somebody called him black, he said they must have thought they had thieved some of the money. They thought blackness was sinfulness. No, it was the color of his skin. We were racialized, and we were made to feel that we were less than. The third part of the the hostile social environment was that we faced racial attack. This reaches a crescendo. 1958 with rioting in Nottingham, rioting in Notting Hill Gate in London, and the death of Kelso Cochrane, first black person killed as a result of racialized violence within Britain. That environment shaped the church. The church then, along with other organizations, said we're going to resist this by doing our own thing. But whereas some of the welfare groups decided to fight the racism, the black church set itself the task of just keeping body and soul together. It became a refuge. How do we know it was a refuge? Look at the signs of some of the first church buildings built here. Shiloh, Bethel. Those are places of refuge in the Bible. Now the problem is when you're in a refuge situation, you sing songs of refuge, not songs of liberation. You're looking at songs that help you keep body, mind, and soul together. The songs came from three sources that shaped the first black churches and shaped gospel music, and this is why it doesn't have liberation. There were the back home songs. These are the songs and choruses which go right back into the Jamaican and Caribbean revivals of the 1860s, 1870s. Revival music are those choruses that deal with empowerment and protection. Jesus be a fence, or build a fence, depending which island you come from. Jesus build a fence all around me every day. See, the first songs were about protection. That's why those songs, they weren't just singing about Jesus protecting them. They were saying, protect me from that wicked boss. Protect me from those wicked people I have to walk past on the street. And for some of the women, protect me from that bad man at home. These were songs, it's true. These were songs of protection. The second category of songs that they sung weren't just the back home songs. They came from the treasured hymnals, the Moody and the Sankey and the Songs of Redemption hymnal. Remember them, the big red one? That's it. The problem with those songs was they didn't deal with liberation either. Those songs produced by people like written by people like Fanny Crosby, Fanny Crosby songs, Pentecostal background. All of those songs came out of the American revival, and they were concerned with three things: sin and redemption and regeneration. Nothing to do with the social world at all. So you've got two sets of songs already that just keep your church locked into protection of the community, not resisting and attacking the world outside. Third set of songs that help solidify a kind of welfare orientation within the church and within the church movement came from the first commercial pop Christian music that we had. This is going back a long time now for you young people. Sorry about this, but we used to have albums by Jim Reeves. God be with you till we meet again. God be with you till we... Remember that one? That was a golden oldie. Pat Boone had gospel albums by Pat Boone. All the early Christian albums that we had also reinforced the idea that gospel music should just keep body and soul together and not address the world outside. Say, why? That's why. Why do we have a situation where gospel has no soul? Because it was birthed in a context that was concerned with just enabling people to survive and thrive and not address the social world outside. So consequently, we have a predicament where the songs that we still continue to sing in church keep us enslaved rather than liberated. Amen. The songs that we continue to sing in church keep us enslaved rather than liberated. To be liberated, and I'm going to end with this and then show the film, you have to have a theology of song that encompasses the social world. Your songs have to sing about what God has to say about the world out there, and not just what God has to say about you as an individual. Now, is that actually possible? Can you actually weave together Christian ideas with socio-political ideas and create a gospel song? Well, yes, we can. I'm going to play one of the tracks from my album, which attempts to do this. Yes, I'm from Coventry. We do everything. We sing, we dance, we do cabaret. If you're born in Coventry, we do it. And this song is called The Incarnation. There's 3 levels to it. It samples the Jamaican New Testament because we got funding from the Jamaican New Testament people to fund it. So it uses Jamaican language to introduce it. John 1:14, the Incarnation. The singing part of it tells the story of the first generation who came here and the discrimination they faced. The visual part of it deals with contemporary discrimination and the tragic situation that is Black deaths in custody. I'm going to screen that, and that's my 10 minutes done.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to listen to us talk to you today. So last time I was here, I don't know if I'm sure a few of you were here for my talk and Dr. Joe's talk. I was tasked with trying to answer this huge question about Windrush and was it worth us coming here. As I will sort of try to, it's a very difficult question to answer, but within trying to explore this kind of question, I'll try to talk about, well, why did we come here? Why did people from the Caribbean come here in the first place? So the first thing we need to say is that sort of 22nd of June 1948, when the SS Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury Docks in Essex, this has sort of been mythologized as the point where Britain became a multicultural country and it was changed forever in terms of being from a homogenous society into a multicultural one. I think it's really important for us to bear in mind that this is not the case, that there has been a constant presence, a constant African presence, I'll use the term African, certainly since Roman times, and certainly as a consistent presence since the 16th century. So there were Black Tudors, and there were consistent Black communities that were in this country from that point on. So it's important. Further to the point, certainly in the 20th century, there was a significant Black community in this country. If we look back to people like Dr. Harold Moody, for example, who started the League of Coloured Peoples in the 1930s. You don't start the League of Coloured Peoples if there are no Black people in the country. To talk about some of the things we've been talking about today, about disenfranchisement, marginalisation, racism, and these sort of structures that were impacting negatively on those communities. So Windrush, as we know, because this is the point everybody seems to want to identify the presence of an African, a Caribbean presence in this country, has become now synonymous with a much darker, a much more sinister set of circumstances. And that circumstance, as you all know, is the so-called Windrush scandal. Okay, so now the Windrush scandal, I have issue with the term Windrush scandal, because the scandal isn't so much with the Windrush, it is the scandal that has firstly affected people who are, you want to call the Windrush generation, but it's more about, in my view, a set of policies, immigration policies, that have adversely affected a particular group of people. Okay, so we know that in 2014, the then Home Secretary, responding to the constant reaction to immigration, immigration as a concept, as an idea, has always been something that has been very much a deep concern for Britain, okay? And over time, well, from the beginning, immigration has been synonymous, has been identified with, if you're an immigrant, you're a criminal. If you're an immigrant, you've come here to take something from this country. Okay, if you're an immigrant, you don't fully belong here. So in response to this sort of panic, this sort of moral panic around these growing immigration levels, she comes up with this so-called policy called the hostile environment policy. Okay, what is the hostile environment policy? It's essentially putting citizens in charge of, essentially they are immigration officers. Okay, you go for a job, you have to prove that you are British or you have your legal documentation. So when you go for a job now, they're going to ask you, where's your passport? You've got to bring in your passport, okay? So if you can't, this is what we're going to do. If you cannot prove yourself to be here legally, we'll make sure you don't have access to work. You don't have access to benefits. You don't have access to medical treatment from the NHS. We're going to make it so difficult for you that you will eventually perhaps deport yourself, leave of your own accord, because the environment is so hostile to you being here. Now, Diane Abbott asked in Parliament when this hostile environment was being proposed and introduced, won't some people who may appear to be not here legally, won't it affect them? Oh no, they said, it won't affect those people at all. Almost immediately, it started to affect people whose parents had come over here from the Caribbean, because they'd come here with their parents, so they didn't have documentation, but they assumed themselves to be British. Okay, so this has been happening certainly since 2014, but it's been happening over 4 years and perhaps even before that. And it's only now, well, last year, that people started to pay attention to what was happening. Okay, and started to report on it, and eventually it became the so-called scandal that we now recognize. Now, it comes in conjunction with a very important moment, which was the 70th anniversary of the Windrush. So in conjunction with 70th anniversary of Windrush, we now also have this horrible scandal of people who are being rounded up, sent to detention centres, losing their jobs, losing access to medical care, losing their homes. Some people have died as a consequence through the stress and the anxiety that it has come upon them. Okay, so this is what Windrush is. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, these ideas around what it means to be British. Who is British? Okay, and it seems with the Windrush scandal, you're British until the state tells you that you're not British. Okay, it's about who, according to the state, has the right to be here and who's entitled to its care. So one of the main themes that we've been heard in response to this so-called Windrush scandal is that the victims of this scandal, they were good people. They paid into the system. They lived here all their lives. They had jobs and families, grandchildren, good jobs. They contribute to the community. They paid their taxes. But I feel this is all irrelevant because these people are human beings. I'm sure some of you will know of somebody who's been going through this right now, who's going through it over the past few years. So the point I'm trying to make is we shouldn't be justifying our presence. We should not be justifying our presence because, and nor should we be justifying or making or highlighting our service to the national development and culture, okay? People should know why we're here, okay? Why are we here? We were here because they were there. That's the question, right? I am here because you were there, right? Here, what is here? Here is the metropole. Here is the city, the center of empire. And over there represents a very dark and violent history, okay? That is what connects us to here, okay? The history of racism, a history of enslavement, and a history of colonization, okay? That is how we purchased our citizenship to this country, okay? That is why we are here. But why did we come here? Why in 1948 did we come here? Well, the war had ended. This country was in a shambles, and they wanted to rebuild it. So they invited people who were part of the empire to come here, or the former empire, because the empire was dying by that point. 1948, the Nationality Act is passed, inviting those who wish to repopulate Britain and help build it to come here. As Professor Bedford said, they did not have us in mind when they passed that act. But they passed it as a blanket act because it would look, well, racist if you said you can come from New Zealand or you can come from Canada, but you can't come from the Caribbean. We don't really want you here. The fact of the matter is that there were lots and lots of initiatives. For example, there were lots of Polish people that were living here. Polish people who had fought on the side of Britain. They were very much encouraged to integrate into the society. Why are they able to integrate into the society? Because, well, they look like the rest of the society. Similarly, with other European countries were encouraged to do so. When there was this knowledge that people from the Caribbean were going to come, they didn't know how to, they did not want us here, but they didn't know how to say, don't come, okay? There was a discussion about actually sending them to other European countries. But the decision was, the decision was in the end was that, well, they'll come over here, but they won't last one winter, okay? Won't last one winter, and then it'll be so cold and they'll all just want to go back to their nice hot countries. So, the other thing we have to consider is that the reasons why people from the Caribbean were coming was called the push-pull factor, okay? What was pushing people out of the Caribbean to come to Britain? It wasn't only that there was work and employment in Britain, it was because the current economic situation in the Caribbean was pretty serious. It was pretty dire. So in 1938, there was the Colonial Office, which was headed by a guy called Lord Moyne. They did a report called the Moyne Report, where they went to Jamaica, they went to the Caribbean, they went to most British Caribbean countries to try and ascertain what was the cultural economic situation there. Also, we've got to bear in mind that during the Second World War, as well as the First World War, the Caribbean sent lots and lots of resources to contribute to the war effort, whether it was money or whether it was materials. They did that, okay? And that's at great expense to them. The Moyne Report, which wasn't released until 10 years later, the reason why they didn't release it until 10 years later is that if they released it and told you, because it reported of a particularly dire economic situation, there was very high unemployment, there was a recession going on there. If people knew about that, then it would cause a lot of upset. Oh dear. So significant upset. So they sat on the report, and it wasn't until sort of 1948, 1947 that they actually released it. But this is why people came. They came because there was no work in the Caribbean. There was no work in the Caribbean. But having said that, there are always a variety of reasons why people leave, okay? So, for example, men who had served in the RAF, who had served in the army, and who had been sent back, as Professor Bedford rightly said, they were sent back. They realized that their worlds were too small. They wanted to venture out. They wanted to have different experience and live different lives. So people like Sam King, the late Sam King, that was one of his reasons why he decided to come back to Britain, and similarly, a lot of ex-RAF men, okay, men who fought in the Second World War. So the reasons for coming were varied, but one of the significant and principal reasons is that economically it wasn't viable for people to stay there. They needed to go out. So there was this push-pull factor. So the question is, was it worth coming here? Now, Professor Beckford showed this whole sort of list of men and women who have died in police custody. Whenever people of African heritage are coming up against the institution, we're coming off the worst for it. It was particularly poignant and touching for me to see, because I saw a man that I knew who died, Olaseni Lewis, my mum's neighbour, his mother's neighbours with my mum. And so we knew him. So we know about the circumstances of his death. How he died was essentially he'd had an episode. He'd taken himself to the hospital. He became agitated. The staff called the police. 11 police jumped on top of him, and he went into a coma. Okay? So whenever our interactions, our engagements with institutions, this is what happens. Okay? So the question is it worth it? I cannot answer only from this perspective. It's more of an existential one for myself. My parents came over in the early 60s. My father came over in 1960, arrived at Southampton. My mother came in 1963, arriving by plane at Gatwick Airport. She joined her mother. So if they hadn't come here, then I would not be here. Okay, so for me it's existential. Our history is always since the moment Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492. That is, as far as I'm concerned, when our problems started. Okay? So from that moment, okay, the moments that our history has been one that has been characterized by resistance and domination. Resistance to that domination and domination. Okay, it's happened in the Caribbean, and it's happened when we came here. If you understand our history, you'll know that people who did come in from the Caribbean, they quickly, once they realized the hostility of the people that they were living among, the white indigenous population, they organized themselves. They became extraordinarily politically aware, and they organized themselves to combat the marginalization and the racism, even in this fine city, okay? If you go and look at the archives, in Birmingham archives, there's a significant amount of material on the anti-racist organizations. And I'm thinking in particular of Henry Gunter, okay, in the 1950s, who came over here and wrote extensively and campaigned extensively against discrimination in housing, against the colour bar, not being able to go to pubs, not being allowed to go into pubs or into hotels. This really existed here. People don't seem to realize that this whole colour bar and segregation wasn't just an American phenomenon. It was also a British phenomenon. Okay? So the question, I think you have to answer for yourselves, whether it was worth it coming here. We came here because we were British citizens. Okay, we weren't coming, we were moving at that time within British territory. Okay, in 1948, the Caribbean was British territory and Britain was British territory. So we were doing nothing particularly unusual in moving from one space to another. As I said, the 1948 Nationality Act gave us the right to do that. So essentially, we were just migrating from one place to another, okay? The other thing we have to also bear in mind is we talked about blackness and Britishness. We are still trying to reconcile what it means to be British as a person of African heritage. They are not mutually exclusive. Of course, you can be British and you can be black, but we're still coming up against and it's very much evident in what's happening today with the whole Brexit discourse that's been happening over the past 3.5 years. Okay? That very much was driven by a particular historical narrative. Yeah? a particular historical narrative that doesn't include we. Okay? It is about this idea that this country can stand on its own, that it is exceptional, that they stood against the Nazis and the Germans, they stood against in Dunkirk and other places. Okay? This country very much has a very nostalgic view of its history. It is no surprise that the most successful television programs are Downton Abbey, Midsummer Murders, okay? Because they speak to an idyllic image of England that many people still want to preserve, okay? That is why they're so popular. But I would just like to close to say that I think it was after the New Cross massacre of 1981, and they had the People's March, and one of the slogans was, "We're here to stay, and we're not going away." So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I'm coming from a non-theological perspective, so it's not going to be informed by any religious discourse. I'm coming to do. Oh, okay, that's all right. I'm coming to talk about a project or a workshop, a dissertation I did for my first degree. It was entitled Blonde Hair, Blue-Eyed Black Girl, and it was basically looking at how black women develop a sense of our beauty given, the realm that we live in, given the fact that we live in a society that is governed and dominated by Western ideas of beauty. So Malcolm X is somebody that is a big influence to myself. I'm part of an organization called OBU, which is an organization of Black unity, and the politics and the constitution of OBU is basically taken from Malcolm X's Organization of African American Unity. Okay, don't worry about the music, it's just an introduction to each thing. So we go to the first video. So I want to start off by a famous speech by Malcolm X, which is basically asking, who taught you to hate yourself? Oh, turn the volume up on my thing as well, sorry.
Who taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate, you should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God gave you?
Okay, so just a minute, but a very powerful question. Who taught us to hate ourselves? Who taught us that the reflection of ourselves, the Almighty, the Creator, who taught us that that person, he or she, does not look like us? Okay? So I particularly wanted to focus on, like I said, black women. When you're doing a dissertation, for anybody that's been to uni or is going to uni, it's 10,000 words, it's a lot of research, a lot of reading. So I always encourage people, do something you're interested in. And I find myself quite interesting, so I wanted to understand not only myself, but my sisterings around me. I wanted to understand some of the things I did as a young black teenage girl. Why did I put a stocking foot on my head and think that that was my hair? When I did my research, I did it in the form of focus groups, and I got groups of black women, and I got us to reflect back to our teenage years. Because obviously if we ask teenage girls now, why do you dress like that? Why do you feel like you need to wear your hair like that? They're not going to be able to answer you now, because I couldn't have answered you when I was 13 and 14, right? So my research was getting a group of women together, and we reflected, we laughed, and we talked about some of the things that we used to do as teenage girls. So my dissertation was divided into 5 key themes. So that was cultural history, looking at the media, looking at colonialism, looking at gender relationships, and notions of personal beauty and where those things come from. So one of the first notions that came up is to basically get them while they're young. So if you think about the young black girls around you, the 3, 4, 5-year-olds, where do they get an idea of how they're supposed to look? Right? A lot of us, especially in this time, we end up with the media, we end up with TV, the cartoons and stuff. But who are these cartoon characters and what do they look like? Yeah? Every little girl, black or white, wants to be, has an idea of being a princess, wants to be beautiful. But if you can think of a Disney character, forget Princess Tiana, because that was Wade. We're talking about for all the years we've had access to media and TV. What has these characters looked like? So where does the influence for a 5, 6, 7-year-old little girl come from? And the answer is from us. It's from us, your nieces, your goddaughters, the children of your friends. They're looking up to you. They're seeing, oh, what does Auntie Kembe look like when I see her? What does Auntie Eve look like? What does Auntie Kush look like? How do we speak about ourselves as women? How do we speak about other women? When we see a woman walking down the road and her hair may not look like us, how do we convey that to the little girls that are picking up these attitudes? So the first thing was notions of beauty are inherited from other women from a very early age. Okay, another thing that affects how black women see ourselves is this associating skin tone with social mobility. So no matter what kind of programs you watch, right, no matter what genre of programs you watch, whether they're British, whether they're American, you will find some common themes. The themes are that lighter skinned women in society appear to be afforded better opportunities. Yeah? They're afforded more positive exposure in the media and are naturally more successful, of course, So, we see this now. It probably seems a bit hard to read, but we see this now. The lighter you are, the perception is, you're associated with higher social mobility. This idea of the house and the field. Yeah, so we know the ones in the house, treated better, access to better resources, etc., etc. That is just now played out, in modern times. So again, there's many films I can think about where, darker skinned women, especially larger, darker skinned women are portrayed as the mammy, the one that looks after everybody, but she never gets the man, does she? She never gets the man, but she's there for everybody. She's normally sick. She's the one that cooks for everybody. She's normally got high blood pressure and is normally dying of something, yeah? A bit exaggerated, but you know what I'm trying to say when I say that, okay? And it's not just black women that are aware of this, because it's not just black women that watch TV. So the black woman, the black man, and the black child is aware of what I've just said to you. What could be all watching the same TV, so we're all seeing this, yeah? So, one of the ways that this thing has started is from a cultural aspect. So I've titled this one, Then My Bleach. Number 1, our culture. Okay, so this is one part-time. I will refer to like Christian discourse. So Victorian Christian discourse associated your body size with your godliness. So the idea was that the more disciplined you are with your food, the more of a worthy Christian you're likely to be. So as you can see, going by that notion, you know what I mean, I probably would have been deemed a very unruly Christian. But as silly as it seems, This is where some of these notions come from. When you look at pictures of the angels, when you look at, when you look at Christian artwork, it's always light, airy, fair. It's all these ideas that they stay with us, yeah? And as we know, Christian values have been forced upon us, not just in the terms of Christianity, in terms of our education, every realm of, we live in a Christian country, which is why everything's closed on a Sunday, which is why we have Christmas holidays and blah, blah, blah. So it is a Christian-dominated society that we're living within, right? And African spirituality, which I'm a big fan of, which is, how I live my life, has been demonized as black magic. Some of the things we do, we don't even realize is African spirituality. When we're at funerals and we're pouring the liquor, we're pouring libation. Well, we don't call it that. We'll say we're going to pour a drink for granny or auntie. But the act of pouring water into the ground is pouring libation, is giving thanks. But we don't talk about things in those terms, right? So we don't realize that even now we're still upholding, African spirituality values. Another thing is the skin bleaching. So these ideas, these notions of light skin and being successful are not just reserved for people like you and I in the ends trying to make it. It's for people that have so-called made it as well. Because like I said, we all have access to the same media. So you'll see pictures of well-known celebrity artists that are still now bleaching their skin, changing the shape of their nose, augmenting themselves aesthetically, and they've so-called made it. So it's not about even having money, because you can have the stack of money and still feel like, nah, I haven't made it yet, because I still look too African, right? A lot of successful, particularly men, yeah, once you have, your best car, and your best this and your best that, the next thing you want is what society deems as the best woman. And like I said, we all watch the same, we've all been fed the same ideologies, which is why a lot of these black football players, musicians, if you can tell me 20 of them that have black wives, then we're doing good. You understand what I mean? So there has to be something behind that. It can't just be that every black successful man has just happened to fall in love with a white woman. There has to be something else going on there, right? Okay, so another issue that we have, when we speak about African history, when we talk about history, especially we're in Black History Month, right? Yeah, we're in Black History Month. People always think about slavery. It's like we've been indoctrinated into thinking that our history only started at the plantation. Do you know how much life we lived before that time? Do you know how much things we were accomplishing before that time? Do you know how civilized we were before the plantation? But yet still, when you talk about black history, or when you make reference to black history, those are the images that come up in people's head. And who wants to talk about being enslaved all the time? It's depressing. It's depressing, yeah? But I found that at 25 years old, that Big Ben in London is named after Benjamin Banneker, the black man that invented the clock. Now, imagine the power. Imagine as a young black child going to school, you're walking in your classroom, like, what? Somebody that looked like me invented a clock. That's in London. And I found that at 25 years old. Yeah? So imagine how empowering that is to a black child, knowing that even though they look in their history books, they've never seen a black person achieve anything. That's a lot of weight to carry for a child. There's never been a black scientist. Black people ain't invented nothing. So you feel, as this poor black child, you've got the weight of, creating all these things. These are one of the things that my dad did his PhD about racism in the curriculum. Whereas, you look in the history and maths books, you would never know that Benjamin Banneker invented the clock, or that Imhotep is a real, multi-genius. Okay, within our history, we do not focus on uprisings. We don't talk about the Haitian Revolution. We don't talk about Bookman Dottie. We don't talk about Nanny and the Maroons. We're constantly seeing films about 12 years of slave and all that rubbish. I'm tired of seeing that. I can't wait for Harriet to come out because I want to see some feel-good films about us. You know what I mean? I want to see some real depictions or at least a balanced view of our contribution to this place. Yeah? We're still dealing with symptoms of the Ma'afa. And Ma'afa is described as basically like a period of almost trauma. So who wants to talk about the trauma that we went through? I don't want to talk about that. We don't want to see that. I don't want to see videos on my Facebook about black people still getting beaten. When I see them things, I just get this right? We're tired of seeing all this. That's why when I do see one or two videos where there's some rebellion, where some black people are fighting, but I play it over and over and over and over again. Because, yeah, it makes you feel good to know that something else is happening, that we do fight back. Because if you only see images of yourself as a passive recipient to something, it doesn't give you much of an incentive to get up and go and to fight back. You understand? So we're still dealing with symptoms of those things. Is that the next one? Or? Okay. As well, this idea of being African, somebody brought it up earlier, why we're not using the term African and why Dr. Beckford decided to use the term black. Now, another thing as well is a lot of us don't want to be associated to anything African. And why is that? Because when you think about Africa, yeah, when you see images of Africa on the TV, 9 times out of 10, what do those images look like? You can shout them out. Poor, the flies, starving, begging. You know, they're always just about to drink the dirty water, innit? They never actually drink it, but they always make sure that they've got the saddest looking child. Now, I decided to go to Ethiopia in 2000. It was our 2007 and their 2000, because they're on a different calendar. They're on a Coptic calendar, yeah? So I went up to Ethiopia to celebrate their millennium in their 2000. And when I got to Addis, and I was seeing like limousines, I was seeing Hyatt hotels. I'm like, this is me as a grown woman with Rasta parents that's got the picture of Selassie all my life. And I still went to Ethiopia and was like, oh my God, look at the place. There's civilization, there's people, people are driving around in Mercedes-Benz. You know, in the middle of Addis Ababa, anybody that's been there can attest to this. It's the biggest city center I've ever seen in my life. It's 8 rows of traffic going one way and 8 lanes of traffic going the other way. I haven't been any other city in the world and had a city center that's that big. And this is me as a 25-year-old black power person gone to Ethiopia like, oh my God. Yes, I did see starving people. Yes, there were beggars, but no more than the beggars in town, no more than the beggars down one stop, no more than the beggars that's waiting for me on Heathrow Road when we leave here. You understand what I mean? So imagery is very, very, very important. Yeah? Many of us as parents feel like, or even carers, feel like we need to be historians to give our children some information about our history, and we don't. It's okay to learn with your children. It's okay to not be able to pronounce African words properly. It's okay if you can't do these things, but if your child doesn't see you learning with them, if you're not willing, have a laugh about it as well. When I first started celebrating Kwanzaa, I couldn't say Kujishagulia. I couldn't say Ujima. I couldn't say these African words, but if you're willing to learn with your children and see your children learning as well, then, it takes that pressure off. Yeah? So yeah, the last point, black teenagers don't want to be associated with anything African, going back to the points that I made, because of basically how it's portrayed. Okay, so going back, so does anybody know Sarah Bartman, Hottentot Venus? Anybody know this woman? She was South African, was brought over, or came over, and basically, she had a big bottom, like, badonk, right? And white people were, like, obsessed with her, as they still are with our bodies now. Yeah, so the black woman's body has always been associated with sexual promiscuity. So when the colonizers came to Africa and they seen black women topless in a non-sexual way, going about their everyday business, looking after their family and stuff, the colonizers saw this as sexuality because, you know, they think a little bit different. So, and according to them, the bigger your bottom was, the more promiscuous she was. So, can you imagine? And my question is, has anything changed? How is the black woman still portrayed in the media? Yeah? I'm not saying that we have artists that cannot sing and cannot perform, but when you look at a music video, or when you look at music videos, the focus ain't on the words, the focus ain't on the song, the focus is on the black woman and her body, and how she can twerk it and jiggle it and all them other things. Yeah, so the idea that the black woman's body has been associated with sexual promiscuity also affects the way we feel like we need to present ourselves as well. Yeah? I think we're coming to the end, don't worry. Okay, so yes. So my question, we use this term, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We've been saying that for years. But if we're wearing colonial lenses, are we really seeing true beauty? If we're only seeing beauty through the Western eyes, is it really something that we're deciding for ourselves? You know, are we really making those decisions? So given that, black women have been left with two choices. Number one is an attempt to climb this beauty pyramid that we know about. Yeah? So we can try it, we can straighten the nose, longer the hair. And it's not an attack on, it's not a given that if you wear weave, you don't love yourself. That's not what I'm saying at all. If you feel like you can't leave your house without it, yeah, that's where I think we need to start looking within. If your child, if a girl, a black girl at 6, 7 years old is looking at a black doll and associating a black doll with being ugly and bad, then we have an issue, right? It's not an attack on people that wear weave. It's not an attack on any of that. It's not an attack on people that want to dress promiscuous. It's the fact knowing that you don't have to. It's the fact that you don't have to, like, you know, you don't have to, what word am I looking for? Somebody help me, give me a word. Internalize these ideas that we have. Okay, so black women are being left with two choices, either an attempt to climb this Western beauty ladder, or what I'm grateful of, what I'm seeing a lot of, is a lot of us are rejecting these ideas of colonial beauty. Yeah, we're saying, forget that, I'm beautiful in my natural state, whether I wear my hair up, down, whether I wear it with a weave or not, whether I wear it straight, curly, whether I comb it, whether I got peppers or not, I'm still beautiful as I stand. Yeah? I think that's it now. And just one final last thing. I just made a documentary about black boys and hair discrimination. I did it for my MA at BCU. I'm screening it at The Legacy on October 30th. It's called Hierarchy, and you can find tickets on Shubs or Eventbrite, or you can come on the night and buy a ticket. 7 o'clock, October 30th. Bye.
Well, thank you very much. I think I was second in the roster for these talks, and the topic that I was given by our director Eve was From Kelso Cochrane to Brexit, Is Racism Over? And if I give you a basic outline of what I try to do with this talk and say a bit about where I think it goes. Firstly, I try to define racism. I won't bother to do that now because I think all of us understand what we mean by racism. But what I did show in getting to answer the question about is racism over, was to show people this, which many of you will be familiar with. There are different iterations of it. But it's basically, this is called race hierarchy. And this demonstrates how in European culture, over the last nearly 1,000 years, Europeans have developed the idea, a philosophical idea, that black people are at the bottom of the human pyramid. And at the top is, of course, the made-up word Caucasian. And I try to show that actually to understand racism that we live with, you have to understand how deeply embedded in Western culture the idea of race is, and the idea that of that race chart, blacks that look like me are at the bottom, and white Europeans are at the top. Now, I then try to show how, over the years, racism in this country, across Europe, in spite of legislation, hasn't really changed. It's just changed its form and shape. But it is actually embedded in the structure and in the fabric, and therefore it takes on this chameleon type of existence. So before the laws, people could put up signs, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. After legislation, they can't put up the sign. They can still behave towards you as though you were a dog or a subhuman. I talk a bit about Kelso Cochrane. Robert mentioned him earlier, and how his death in 1959, how not only did it lead to the carnival that we see in London through a response to it, but I talk about his death and how reminiscent of Stephen Lawrence's death his death actually was. And again, the paper will be available, you can see it. But my basic point is that all through the years, from Kelso to Brexit, what we see is a reflection of a racism that did not just start there, but has its roots in the embodiment of racism as a feature in European life. Now, I talk about how some of our responses to this. Now, this is the stiletto knife that killed Kelso, or something like it, that killed him. And there were two pictures that I flagged up. One was of this one, which you can't see, I know from where you are very well. But it is how, after Kelso Cochrane was stabbed to death, and nobody was ever convicted of his death, the turnout of the community, black and white, was quite astonishingly large. Lots of people came out to the funeral. There was also a protest by, and forgive me, my brother, for using black, but that's the political term at the moment. There was a protest against the death, and this is symbolic of it. A few black people actually out protesting. So that says something about the inertia that we have actually in terms of our response to what happens to us in terms of the racism that is perpetrated against us. And I'm going on to suggest that actually part of our problem, if it is a problem, is that we don't have a deep understanding of some of these issues and the context in which we live, and therefore sometimes our responses to it are actually quite lukewarm, as in the response to Kelso's death. And sometimes I fear that this is not in the paper, but I'm just adding it in, that our response to Christianity is similarly reactionary. Now, it's quite popular in some black sectors to say, Jesus is down, rubbish with Jesus, the way with Jesus. I have always found, not always, maybe more so in my later years, that actually it is quite easy, A, to recognize that Christianity was in Africa long before the Europeans got there. Secondly, to recognize that the suffering Jesus is actually not far removed from the experience of black people. And thirdly and finally, to synthesize a Christianity with black existence that does simply not buy into a Eurocentric version of what Christianity might be. Our friend talked about libation. I remember about 15, 20 years ago, I, as director of the Center for Black and White Christian Partnership, held a service in Birmingham Cathedral. And I insisted in that service on having a massive plant brought into the cathedral that we used as a center for libation in a Christian service. And one of the things that stand out most for me till this day was a very moving moment when I invited people to come up and to pour some water on this big plant in the center of the cathedral and to remember somebody from their past. And I still remember, and it almost makes me cry when I think about it, a woman who came up and she said that she was remembering her mother because her mother, to her dying day, worked hard to put her through university, but died before she graduated and has never lived to see her now as a mature woman with the education that her mother worked so hard to give to her. And she poured the water on the plant, called out her mother's name. I mean, everybody in that place was in tears, or at least with wet eyes. So I am very aware how powerful carrying African-centered praxis can be applied to our situation. The truth is, as Robert was quietly pointing out, sometimes, and somebody else said, sometimes black clergy are very coward of departing from the very narrow confines of Eurocentric Christianity. And that is a challenge that we face right now. So I go through that. In my last 5 minutes, let me say where I went to with my paper and add something else. Because I suggest that our response to racism is very important. But it begins, as I've said, with recognizing racism as part of the fabric of Western society. Because that then shapes how we respond to it. If we think, for example, that stopping people in a football stadium from making monkey noises and throwing bananas on the pitch, if you think that by stopping that, you have got rid of racism, then you're making a big, salutary mistake. You might stop it happening there, but you haven't changed the heart of the racist. So I suggest in my paper 4 things that we might talk about, the 4 Ps as to a response that we might make to racism. But I'm inserting this in the further development of this paper that I am taking forward to other places, to say that overarching the 4 points I want to quickly mention is a shift in our psychology that I believe is important. Bob Marley says that we are buffalo soldiers. We're not passive recipients of what's given to us, fighting on arrival, fighting for survival. But that fighting needs to find its root, I believe, and I am advancing, in our understanding of ourselves as Africans in exile. And I am basing that further piece of work on a passage of scripture from the book of Jeremiah, an Old Testament prophet, in the 29th chapter of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah writes to the Jewish exiles in Babylon. And he says, now you find yourself in exile, this is how you should behave. And I have it on my phone, so let me just quickly give you a read of what Jeremiah says to the exiles. We, I fear, Africans, many of us are running away from our Africanness. And in trying to resolve the issue about how we relate to a racist society, we are going the route of running for acceptance. That's what is high on most people's agenda. It's acceptance we want. The truth is, many of us are quite embarrassed about being black and being African. And I am just saying, and as I go on delivering this paper, developing the paper, that the shift we need to make in our mindset is an acceptance that we are first and foremost Africans in exile. If you accept that shift, then it means you bring up your children to understand that they are first and foremost Africans. And Jeremiah says to his fellow Africans, to his fellow Jews in exile, he said, now that you are carried away into Babylon, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you also prosper. Now, that shift in mindset that says, actually, I'm not from here really. My roots are back on the continent, on the mother continent of Africa. But I'm here, so I'm going to settle down. I'm not looking for acceptance. I'm not asking you to accept me as an honorary white. I'm African. And I know you are made in the image of God, just like I am, but I'm not trying to be like you. The truth is, my friend, very often, what many of us are trying to do is to run down that acceptance route of becoming accepted almost as an honorary white. And I'm sorry to say, but when I read people like for Hirsch, that's what I hear coming out loud and clear. I want acceptance. Accept me. I beg you, accept me. I'm one of you. No, you are African, and you're living in exile. And so the points quickly that I made here when I talked about, because I'm going to develop those themes around Jeremiah 29 and those 4 verses, but with the big shift of saying, no, first and foremost, you're African. I said that the 4 P's that I believe will help us greatly in exile. The first P was protection. Forgive me if I read. The country in which we live in the West must provide protection, and in this country, by and large, we have lots of anti-racism laws. By and large, thanks to the death of the likes of Kelso Cochrane, who I talk about, and Stephen Lawrence, the campaigning work of many, we have in Britain what are arguably the strongest anti-racism laws of any European country. The price has been high, and it divides opinion whether British laws are strong enough. That's the first point I make. We don't want to live in a society where you can just, somebody can just look at you and just, spit in your face, and there are no repercussions. And I'm saying, by and large, and sometimes I wish we would tone down our protest about what life is like in Britain a little bit, because if you go to practically any other European country, those laws hardly exist there. The second P that I talk about was protest. That black people must never passively suffer racism. The place for protest must remain sacrosanct, even if at times protest seems an aggravation, even to some of us on whose behalf the protest is made. We need a Rottweiler spirit among us to bare their teeth as well as the pussycats. The third P, and I'm closing in 1 minute, is power. Black people urgently must become strong and powerful economically, socially, politically, and spiritually. This is true of us as individuals, as families, and communities. We absolutely take must absolutely take power seriously. And for example, the crippling effect of generational poverty that can be countered by education, entrepreneurialism, and a simple thing like life insurance. Too many of us die with no money left for those who we leave behind, and we perpetuate poverty from generation to generation. And the last P that I talk about is power. Black people urgently must become strong and powerful. That's the one, that's what I just said. That's not the last one. Let me just get to the last one. Or maybe that was the last one. Maybe it was. Who knows? Let me just stop there and say that my key message is racism in the West is going nowhere fast. Do not plan on the false dawn that soon this will be a non-racial society. It ain't happening. Racism is far too embedded in the psyche of the West for it to be going. So don't bank on that. What you have to bank on is how can you actually transcend racism. And I love the psalmist, if I go back, I'm a Christian, right? The psalmist says, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." No, your enemies don't have to be gone for you to prosper. You can prosper right in their face and laugh right in their face. But when you understand that actually I'm not trying to appease you, I'm not trying to be like you, I'm not looking for your acceptance or your endorsement. I'm a foreigner. I'm African. I'm in exile. I think that changes the game. Thank you.
Right, thank you everyone. Right, Black history. Black history, if we think about 1980s, when I was tasked to do this, I was given the 1980s to talk about. So let's think about 1980s and what Black history meant in the 1980s. That's what I'm going to start with. Then what it means now, and then how we can then move towards the future. So, in the 1980s then, let's think back. We had a new Prime Minister, did we not? From 1979. And what did we call her? The Iron Lady. Yes, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. That was 1980s. All right, where are we now? The 19th of October, 2019. Look at the Prime Minister. The faces may change, but goes back to what you're saying. So it's therefore up to us in terms of the strategies for the future. Hostile environment. We're talking about hostile environment now. Hostile environment in the 1980s, what did that look like? If we're thinking about power and policies, we mentioned about racism. Racism is enacted within institutions. It's part of the policies. It doesn't just happen. But then when we talk about policies, we remember policies aren't just bits of paper. There's a poem by my sister which says, "It's in your paper policy designed by you, for you, not me." Policies are designed by people. My background is education and it's also leadership. I've actually got a PowerPoint, but I kind of feel a bit powerful without the PowerPoint at the moment. But I might go back to it because it's got some good images. So policies, and in my talk that I did, I mentioned education policies in detail. We haven't got the detail now, but my paper will. Rampton, Swan, and then the 1988 Education Act. And if we go back to that, and I will in my paper, you will see that the things that are happening now, it happened. 1988 was pivotal in terms of the things that are happening in terms of education. So part of our strategy for now is to actually make sure that we know not just the policies within England, on a global level as well, But when I work with parents, I said we need to know what the policy says. The situation is different now. And part of our changing for the future is realizing that the strategies we had in the 1980s cannot always be translated into now. We have to work with what's happening now. Well, from the Caribbean, there's a phrase called walk with it. You work with it as it is now, not as you would like it to be, and not as you think it's going to be in the future, but we work with the situation as it is now. And in working with that situation as it is now though, we look at what leaders and what our community, people like us did in the 1980s. And I was part of all the activism. 1980s was a recorded activism. It was very, very active. Because we weren't sitting and looking at this and the Instagram and preaching ourselves up to show a picture on Instagram. No. To me, what's happening today is almost like a resurgence of the things we were doing in the 1980s. And one of the things was, we had leaders and influencers that moved around the country. Now, for those who were there at my discussion, we mentioned people like Len Garrison. Now, people that were here, they reminded me, I knew Len Garrison as a teacher. I was interested in getting the black curriculum in schools. I was interested in making my lessons as culturally diverse as possible. I was interested. I taught near Brixton, and I was like this little young girl then, tall black boys, and some of those teachers said they were afraid of him. Afraid? I was afraid. So when somebody like you came into my class and you had your cap on your head, I just give you one look. And if you didn't take it off, I took it off. I took it off like your mother or like your auntie. And that was different. It was different from when I became head of English. I was head of English in 2 different schools. I had some teacher come up to me. I'd like to have a word with you. I wasn't Dr. Cole then. I'd like to have a word with you after school, Luna. You don't need to know the name of the school. And what did she say? I'm scared. And what she literally said, she was scared of some of the black boys in her school. And it wasn't now. It was then. But when I actually unraveled what she was scared of, she didn't even have to know what they were like to be scared. It was the fact that they were bigger to be scared. So one of the things in terms of our power is that when we're in leadership positions, we still have to bring, well, I believe, not everybody does, but my power, my source of power comes from knowing who I am. My source of power comes from being firmly rooted in my cultural identity. My source of power knows that I come from a poor family, but a damn good family. That's my source of power. And it also means, as a leader though, when you're in institutions, you can't let things like that go. But the strategies in the 1980s may well be different from the strategies now. But in moving forward, power is important. But I don't think that we acknowledge our power sometimes. We don't acknowledge our power. Somebody said to me at once, you don't know how powerful you are. Because power doesn't necessarily come from money. It helps, but you've seen poor people, you've seen rich people, and what happens. But for us, we need economic empowerment, yes, but our cultural identity is a strength. And we really do have to nurture that. In moving forward, one of the strategies is to make sure that our young people, that we pass some of that on. The tragedy for me is that many of those things that happened in the 1980s have almost been erased from memory. We talked about that in the past. And our younger generation don't always know. I'm talking simple things. I would say a word like Dutch pot, and it's like, Dutch pot? So it doesn't have to, I mean, when we teach, teaching is not just about books. And also, what happens then when Granny is the one that they get their culture from? What happened when Granny gone? What are we doing in terms of making sure that history, that cultural history, that identity is actually part of how we live? And I think as leaders, we need to think of ourselves as leaders, not just in our organizations, but as leaders almost in our families. Because one of the things, but when I referred to my speech, I mentioned people like the great leaders and influencers. Les Garrison was one, Gus John, and they were great. Gus John is still here, and he's still working it. He's still standing up for his rights and our rights. And they moved around the country. Garrison, he set up the African Caribbean Education Resource Centre, and the Education Resource Centre, which I went to as a teacher, as I said, to get cultural diverse information. Well, that's become the Black Cultural Archive. So when people say we haven't done anything, we really need to make sure that we have that knowledge, but we need to record that knowledge as well. So that Black Cultural Archive, which we've been to, is small, but it's powerful, and it had a history. But it was one man that started it. And what he did, he would come to meetings like this and take photographs and do this, etc., etc. But he was a different kind of leader. And there's a phrase, I think it's Nelson Mandela, and he says that it's something along the lines of leadership. When you lead, it's sometimes best to lead so others don't even know that they're being led. Think about that. How many people do you know who may not have some awards and accolades, and they may not be politicians, but they're leading? And sometimes, particularly that younger generation, if I go and start berating you, you must do this, you must do that, blah, 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 then I don't think that is the way. But it's also learning as well. So, you mentioned that it's important that young men, they actually meet on their own to talk about the issues related to black boys and young men. I think that's good. And for us also, it's important as women to meet, perhaps as a group, and talk about some issues. But in terms of moving forward, what we also need to do is to make sure that we have a dialogue. And we share our ideas, don't you think? Yes. We have to, otherwise we won't learn. And I might end up, we make assumptions. And those kind of assumptions are what others make about us. So there is room for that dialogue among generations as well. There is room for that dialogue. Okay, I'm going to finish now. I did have lots and I think afterwards I will mention, I'll go through some of the slides for the pictures, but in relation to black women, part of that leadership, it also included Black Women's Collectives and the Heart of the Race in 1985. That's been very, very powerful, and some of you were involved in that. So the whole idea, the counter-narrative of Margaret Thatcher, Iron Lady, and then Black women, the heart of the race, there are so many things to unpick about that and how we can make sure our role models doesn't have to be something like that. Going back in terms of our culture and our identity and our history, as black women, we nurture our own identity, and that counteracts some of those images you were mentioning about feeling that we have to look like Beyonce or whatever. Because the image is out there, but we can also protect our image. So we need to reconceptualize leadership. What does leadership mean? Yes, 1981 it started with activism, and that was and what the leadership was there. A black man or dark as how and others, they got the whole of the country together to protest against the types of things that are happening now. A march. And one of the things that somebody said to me after my talk last time was, do you think that nowadays there is any black leader that could get the whole country together? Do you?
Yeah.
Who? Not
There, but you said that...
the whole country, the whole country. No, that's fine, that's fine. No, okay, you do it. And what about that side as well? Do you think there's anybody in terms of, can you name, who can bring the whole, because really, we have a lot to protest about. And the point, I think, my view is that yes, and we have many with the right leadership qualities, but it needs a lot more harnessing and maybe going back to what they did then in order to move things forward for the future. But the point is, what we need to do is to make sure that the strategies that we use build on what those leaders did, build on the learning from that, but we also have to learn to flex for the situation. That flexibility is the essence of survival. And initially, oh, I didn't realize you were here. And initially, I didn't realize what my mum meant when she said that. But it's things like, a lot of our learning, our leadership, our power, it comes from our family. And please don't, that image about the black family, it's just an image. Because of family, we still call people aunties, things like that. I was talking to people, they said, auntie. And I said, do you know what, I still call somebody auntie at my age. And where other people are saying, no, we don't do that anymore. No one does that anymore. But you can stand back and say, why not? There's a place for some of that, surely. So don't forget and relinquish our cultural legacy, but also remember to bring new people along, bring our youngsters along, learn from them. And hopefully they will also learn from us. I'm going to leave it there. There's so much more I can say, but I want to hear from you in terms of what you think about some of the things I've said. Thank you.
Hello, it's a long wait, it feels. And Eve asked me, welcome, Eve asked me if I would address the 60s, which included Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the best way forward and the best way to resist racism. As you all know, that they were great men, and I don't want to label it as in year by year their achievements due to the time. But they were both different people and brought very different things. Malcolm X was a person who was very clear and very clear about the way that he saw us moving forward. He saw us moving forward by any means necessary and actually taking things and putting them where they rightfully belonged. And he had no qualms about how he viewed his identity, or the identity and the things that he was prepared to fight for. Martin Luther King, he was obviously a Christian and looked forward to the church or the beliefs of the church to forward his role in what he saw where we should be going as black people. So both people had the same ideas when it came to getting where we needed to go, as far as that could be seen. They wanted us to have equal rights, progress, and everything that was really ours, but we would have to fight for them in very different ways. Malcolm was definitely someone who was not going to take things sitting down and pretend that everything was okay. He was proud to be black. He fought for black supremacy, and his ideas were very clear. Martin Luther King took the view that we should follow the church's route, which offered us a Christian way of everyone being the same and, you know, loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek and stuff like that, which as time has gone on, we have noted that is not possibly, or neither could possibly be, the only way forward. The churches, both churches, or any churches that we have, they were built on slavery. The white church was built on slavery, and nowhere where you've got that embedded in the church will we ever be able to succeed. I don't care what anyone says about that, because if you've got institutional racism based into a system, no matter how hard you fight, you will not get that out. And as a people, we have embodied that, and we've read the Bible, not that that's wrong, and we've looked at, lots of us have looked and accepted a picture hanging over a fireplace of Jesus, and actually we're actually scared to do anything because this person was so powerful and would destroy us if we didn't do what we wanted to do. Yet on the other hand, we're told that we can do whatever we feel like and ask for forgiveness and we'll be forgiven. So I'm not quite sure which story of that one was the right story. So following the church route has had its inadequacies, because both churches have sort of remodeled themselves on each other. And I too have been through a whole range of different churches, because I was christened as a Methodist, then went on to be a Church of England person, then went to be a Catholic, and then finally got baptized as a Pentecostal, and then at the end of the day, I feel that I then wrote a book after called When God Calls, which is based on the individuals having their own relationship with a church or with God. You cannot build a relationship through no disrespect, your pastor or the bishop or whoever else. You have to build your own relationship with God and work through that. I also poured libation and worked with African history and African religion. So I think what I'd like to say about the situation is that at the moment, I have lots and lots of facts and figures about fighting for changes in laws, changes in legislations, civil rights legislations. What has happened since? Not a lot has changed. And where Britain then has adopted, and we had race relations laws and stuff like that, what's happened is that racism has gone underground. We as a people have allowed it to seep along as well, especially in the use of language. And I will say that with stuff like the so-called unconscious bias. Because if we've looked and we've seen the change, how we've allowed the change of mixed parentage children or biracial children, and it started off with half-breed, mulatto, mixed race, half-caste, mixed race, bi-race, or whatever have you, that at the moment we stood back and we've allowed that same use of language that we used, and we've joined it as it's come along. And I think unconscious bias is just another way of trying to water down racism and make it more acceptable and unpalatable to others. And therefore, I think we have got a lot to answer for. And I think as a people, we are very competitive with each other. And I think that both Malcolm and Martin would be very saddened to see what has happened and where we've arrived. After all the things that were fought for in the 60s, I used to think that racism would kill us. However, I now see that a large number of young people are killing each other. So not only have we got one thing to fight against, but two things, or several things. But what I would like us to do is to remember the good things that people have fought and fought hard for from in the 60s. In America, lives lost. And here we are now asking and talking about the same thing without actually forming ourselves into groups or a group that would represent each other. One of the things as well is that I think we've all joined around and followed the so-called route that we don't have to follow. And that is, although a lot of parents and grandparents bemoan their lot when their grandchild or child gets into trouble, some parents don't actually see what they're creating in their homes, because if one person has got something, they're never satisfied to support that person's business or see that person in the same light. It becomes very competitive. And I sometimes think, well, what's the difference between sitting there and thinking about, that person and what that person's got, and I want it, or I must have something better than theirs. And if these are the stories that we're sharing with our children and grandchildren, and then when they go and rob or do something to another person, we bemoan our lot, then I don't think that with all the other things that are going on in schools, in society, politically, that we really are giving our children and our grandchildren a chance to actually go out there and thrive in this society. I think that, of course, education is very important, and both Martin and Malcolm felt that we should always be educate our children so that it wouldn't happen that we would always be at the end of the pile. And Martin said, if you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl. But whatever we do, we should keep moving forward. And in the end, to also remember not the words of our enemies, but sometimes the silence of our friends. And I think that that's a good one, because a lot of black people that have white friends sometimes will not see the silence when and as it's necessary, but would certainly see the open and overt stuff that's going on around racism. Whereas Malcolm said, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone, but if someone puts a hand on you, send them to the cemetery. Now, people would say that that's mighty violent. And his end, the one of the ones that I do like is that you can't separate peace from freedom, because no one can be at peace unless he or she has their freedom. And we certainly haven't got our freedom. We might think we have, but we haven't. And as someone who has been fighting for a long time, from in the 60s or probably just before that, as a young person, as you said before, as a young person, when I was a young person, when I had my 30th birthday, because I'd been forever being active, this person thought that I was about 50, not because I looked it, but because I'd been around that long fighting. We fought for the ACFF building in Nottingham, which was the one that Len Garrison came up to run. And we fought for that, and we fought for a number of other things. And the Marcus Garvey Centre, that's in Nottingham, the African Caribbean Friends and Families Centre, and I actually was the director of ACFF. But you fight for these things, you go to meetings, meetings upon meetings upon meetings, and at the end of it, you think, what was it all about if we are still here debating the same things that we were in the 60s? And in the end, after leaving a long career in social work, to which the final straw was when the director said, make sure that Diane Sealy-Skerritt at the time, do not get any further forward because she is destructive. But it wasn't because I was destructive, it was because I was ensuring that black workers within social services was given a just future. And he actually told that at assistant director level, and I'd just left there before then. So I was there when black children were fostered to white carers and didn't have the proper hair care or anything else. So I've pioneered a lot of work, and when I see at the moment that we're still where we're at, it makes you cringe, to be honest. So we must educate ourselves as well still, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, so that they can all know where we started, the great people that have fought for us, and that we need to stand tall, stand proud. Don't join the gang at the moment, which is let's segregate black people amongst themselves, because there's a new term as well called colorism. And people are saying, oh, well, colorism's destroying us and this and that. But if you look back in the Caribbean, people are not hung up as much, I don't think anyway, on what color you are. If you are black, you're black. And I know people are afraid of being called African still, but I have no qualms about that. I've been to Africa quite a lot, to different parts of Africa, Burundi, Gambia, the Ghana, etc. And I've found what I needed to find and will continue to search. So I realize time is against me, and there's one other person who wants to speak and get away. So I have definitely cut it shorter than what I would have liked it to be. Thanks. Oh yeah, it's in the book. I've actually got the book here. After leaving the diocese in Southwell and Nottingham for 10 years, supposedly working as an equality and diversity officer, which just didn't work in the Anglican Church, I wrote a book which is called When God Calls, but it's about each and every one of us having our own relationship with God, and each and every one of us having a purpose, each and every one of us being unique and valuing your unique self, your gifts, and whatever else you've got, and that your calling starts when you arrive and your calling finishes when you go. So therefore, that's the book. It's here and it's outside. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I am not too long from the Bahamas and struggling with some jet lag, so forgive me. But keep my country in your thoughts as we deal with rebuilding, which highlights so many issues to do with what it means to be an African Caribbean nation in between imperial powers. And on every level, we have to ask the question, do Bahamian lives matter? But if Reverend Eve gave me the topic of do Black Lives Matter to end our series of conversations, my immediate question would be to whom? Because speaker after speaker spoke about legacies of racism, of inequality, of oppression. That's the fabric of this society and others, Western nations. But let's move beyond that. Do Black lives matter to Black people? That's a critical question. When Kush stood up and spoke about our attitudes to color, our attitudes to our children, our attitudes to our ancestral religiosities, to Black Lives Matter. We spoke about organizing and representing ourselves. Do Black Lives Matter? Are we even united enough? Or do we exist to separate from each other so often that really, on the outside, the big question is, do they matter? How can we see it? What are the things I want to highlight, and I will not be long, and I want to turn some questions over to you. Black Lives, the campaign came about, and through social media it spread, and it became quite powerful, just like the Me Too movement. And it highlights that persistent thing that black suffering is designed. Yes, we know that. It is deeply psychological. And there are legacies of it that goes generation after generation after generation. We have to grapple with that. You cannot have this conversation without talking about legacies of trauma. Our history does not begin with slavery, but something traumatic happened and is perpetuated generation after generation. And just like racism, it won't just go away. When you have a traumatic event, that's nothing to play with or ignore. And trauma works in that it disrupts everything. And we can cover it up as much as we want, but it's there. Two scholars that are important, certainly from my view of things, is Joy L. DeGruy. You've heard the post-traumatic slave syndrome. Very important concept in that there are legacies of trauma that manifest in every aspect of black life. No matter where you are from or where you exist. But then there's something else called the wake. I think you call it nine night. In the Bahamas, we call it setting up. Setting up. We can say setting up. And if you remember, every island from the Caribbean has certain these traditions. And Christine Sharp makes the point that there is this aspect of the wake that follows black existence, and this aspect of death, early death, the inevitability of death. You see it in health or lack thereof, mental ill health, imprisonments, diabetes. We have that thing called sugar that's not sweet at all. What is that about? And it's a way of understanding black existence. And I'm using that term politically, so. But then, if we go back to this idea of trauma, we have to also contend with what scholar after scholar throughout history have termed in different ways. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, speaks about double consciousness. In my one black body, I'm at war. In my one black mind, I'm at war because the thing I am, I hate. And the thing I am not, I want to be. And then you have Frantz Fanon talking about the colonial situation. And in situations of colonialism, there is always within the oppressed an internalized self-hatred because colonialism teaches you to hate yourself in every possible way. Marcus Garvey, well, Garvey speaks for himself, but the only remedy for this kind of deep self-hatred is black consciousness. Consciousness. Being conscious and self-love of who you are. George Lamming, you know who George Lamming is? Novelist, yes, Barbadian. He spoke about, we have this thing called a collective amnesia, because there is this underlying self-negation, that's my term, and self-hatred, but we forget that it's there. It's like trauma. You have the wound and you cover it up. It's like abuse of any kind. Sexual abuse, for example. You become an adult and then you realize after a time you're an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and you hardly can function. You look the part, you function, but something's not quite right. Same thing on a grand scale. So, with all that's happening and all that's been said, here is my question to you, and then I shut up. Do Black lives matter to black people? How do we know that?
This is the main thinking behind this afternoon. It's been incubating for some time, lots of conversations. And like you, I'm tired of talking, of us talking and talking and talking. And that's why black leadership is so important to me. Black academic is so important to me. I grew up in a home where I was told that I've come from a bright family. And my auntie was always saying, you should be proud of that. Your family, our family, is very bright. And so growing up with that kind of confidence as a child and coming to England, coming from a private school in the Caribbean to England, and them just smash me up. By the time I leave school, my confidence had gone. Them trample all over it. Did you write this essay, Evadne? And you know the question, So those questions are still hanging there for the young person in school who is still being undermined, albeit in a very sophisticated way. They just changed the way of doing it. It's a bit like unconscious bias. Changed the wording. So it seems to me that if today and this weekend is going to be useful, this can't be the end of it. Okay? This cannot be the end. We've got to find a way as a group at some point. I know you're all busy people, and we've got to find a way of using what we have talked about this weekend in a way that is going to be useful for us as a tool. Does that make sense? Because it's the only way that this, for me, is going to make sense and not to waste our time. Because I walk about on the buses and the road. I don't drive. I deliberately don't drive. And I see the despair. I see and experience the trauma Dr. Carlton spoke about so eloquently. If you don't believe it, just sit down for a minute and listen to an old lady talk about her experience. The trauma is almost tangible. And that's why I love that book, and that's a really brilliant book that Dr. Carlton spoke about, the Daphne DeGroot, or was it Joyce? Joyce DeGroot. Anyway, the traumatization that we have suffered, it can't go away, it doesn't disappear. We just learn to mask it. And when we hear about Malcolm and Martin, it's not about choice, choosing one over the other. How do we take the best of their philosophy to implement the changes that we need? How do we look at the leaders of the 80s and begin to use the best and the legacy they have to build on that legacy? How do we look at Cush's generation and their struggle for some of the struggles for self-acceptance? How do we look at the role of the black church and gospel music? What message we're sending out? I mean, I went to a gospel service not long ago, and by the time I left there, I almost didn't believe in God. because I couldn't believe that the people who have been so damaged by history were still thinking and singing about heaven. Every song them sing was about heaven. And I'm thinking, get me out of here. This was only this week. And I, as a minister, struggle with that because I see that the songs have kept us exactly where we are. And it's not going to move us on anytime soon unless we really begin to sing a different song in this strange land. All of the speakers today have had something crucial and profound to say to us. Dr. Osborne asked the question, was it worth coming here? It's not a yes or no question. It's about the complexities of the experience that our parents and our grandparents had to deal with and their arrival in post-war England. All of these papers are crucial if it's to make a contribution for us to move on and to begin to work with other people. One of the things I want to do is to find other leaders, young and old, who said, let's come together. The dream of having a think tank is something that I wake up thinking about it. We want great minds to come together. And yes, I know we're busy, but to use those great minds, not just for people who are here, but people from among yourselves, to actually begin to think our way out of the crisis that we're in. For those of us who are fighting for acceptance, I am not. Them soon kick me out of the Church of England, but we're not here. And I never have cared. You ask my husband, if you look back on letters I wrote 30 years ago, looking for theological education, and saying to the principal, I want a theological education that helps me to see through my own spectacles. And he looked at me as if I was mad. So nothing much has changed, but we have great men like Dr. Carlton at Queen's and others, and Dr. Robert Beckford, who will help us. But we need your minds. We need you as well to say, how do we develop a think tank with people who are serious about change? I don't mean because we want to say we're doing a grand job. I mean people who are really serious about change, because that's what I am about, and that's what I'm sure my brothers and sisters here are about. Today must not be a waste. It must be the first, the second, third step to creating something new, because we have people like Diane who've given years to the Church of England, and we know the toll it takes on us when we work for the institution we call the church. We know the good things and the not so good things about it. I want to thank the speakers, those who have gone because of family commitment, for giving up their time over the past year or so, and to come here to do this. It's not about money, it's not been discussed, it's about the love of our people. So I want to say thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lorna. Thank you, Kush. Thank you, Dr. I just call her doctor because I think she's a doctor anyway. Yeah. And of course, thank you to yourselves. Please fill the form out, and just give me some ideas to how this evening has gone, so it can be bettered and we can be improved upon. Nothing is ever perfect when you're dealing with human beings, like traffic and all of that. It has a knock-on effect. So I want to say a big thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.